So we're coming up to a series of local elections that are going to be quite big and probably quite a big challenge for Labour. Now, I think a lot of the areas they do have a significant chance to win. I do think that even though the Tories are on a bump, I think that the Green Soul scandal is going to hurt them. And when it comes to local issues, because nationally, while stuff like the Green Soul scandal does have an impact on local elections, mainly it's happening on the ground, and local issues matter sometimes far, far more than what is going on in the national picture. And this is one area where I can say we are actually quite good. The local Labour and the grassroots membership during the pandemic have gone out and got in interacting in the local area. They have been running food banks, helping out, OAPs get food, all sorts of kind of stuff that they have done off their own back. And a lot of these people are the councillors and the people in the local CLPs. So absolutely fantastic work by them. And there is a good chance that at local elections we could do quite well. Obviously, there is the Hartlepool by-election as well, which is also going to be quite important. And as we've said before, the Tories are going to be watching that like a hawk, because there is a potential, seeing that, other things could potentially happen. We might get off the back of that a potential for Boris Johnson to think that he has such a strong hand that maybe he decides to punt for an early election. We don't know. It could be very well be possible. We'll have to wait and see. However, there is one election that Boris Johnson will be watching like a hawk, because this is going to affect him personally. Because there is a myth around Boris Johnson about how good of a politician he really is, and it all starts with his tenure as being mayor of the City of London. Now, of course, you can go back and actually look at his entire tenure, and it is exactly like his prime ministerial role at the moment. He was surrounded by a team of people who did all his work, and yet there were constant scandals, there were constant upsettings, and yet, again, Boris Johnson's magic shield managed to keep him safe during that time in his mayoral office. But it was not as good as the myths and legends make it out to be. And unfortunately, he is basically continuing this style as the PM. And unfortunately, this style of, I don't want to make decisions, I'll let someone else do it, is not what we really need from someone who is the Prime Minister. They actually need to make decisions. So, as we dive into the bit about the mayoral race and what's going on in London, please do remember to hit that like and share button. And of course, down below, there is a link to my Patreon page, as well as a one-off donation link called Buy Me a Coffee, where you can, buy me a coffee. And thank you to all those people that do support me that way. So, this comes from The Guardian, and the title is, It's His Turf. Why London's mayoral race is personal for Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson had almost finished his most recent Downing Street press conference when his tone suddenly shifted. Sadiq Khan had left a black hole in the Transport for London's finances, said the energised Prime Minister, and the capital's mayor should be held to account for his spending. Beyond the ensuing controversy about Johnson and a COVID-focused event launched a partisan attack, his words demonstrated something else. The Prime Minister was still deeply invested in a city he ran for over 8 years, and is painfully aware that a successor as a Conservative mayor looks increasingly unlikely. In a series of polls, including one on Tuesday, put Khan, the Labour mayor who took over from Johnson in 2016, on a 50% or more of the first choice votes on the 6th of May, and more than 20 points ahead of his Tory rival, Sean Bailey. While most Conservatives privately blame Bailey's often hapless campaign and candidacy for the gap, it also illustrates one of the starkest changes to affect British politics in recent years. and a more general Conservative collapse in London. Tony Travers, the visiting professor at the London School of Economics Department for Government, has produced a chart of the general election vote share in London, which broadly tracks the wider tolls in Britain for decades, and it starts to diverge wildly in the late 90s, and particularly since 2010. At the 2019 election, Labour's London share was 15 percentage points higher than its national total. The Conservatives was 13 points lower, and since 1992, the number of London seats held by Tory MPs has nearly halved. It is, as Travers says, in part down to national factors, such as changes in the party alignment that mean younger urban voters increasingly support Labour. Additionally, London's demographics have changed. Johnson's mayoral election win in 2008 and 2012 was largely based on a donut strategy, harvesting votes from the more suburban and often more predominantly white outer suburbs. However, Travers says, the outer London is increasingly diverse and more like inner London used to be. The YouGov poll last week found Khan easily winning in outer London by 45% to 28% lead over Bailey on the first preference votes. The Conservatives could very easily drop below their current lead of the 25% London Assembly seats as well. Travers predicted that while the next round of London council elections in 2022, more boroughs will become, in effect, one-party Labour seats. To an extent, history is repeating itself. The Conservative-led push to create the Greater London Council in the early 60s was in part to expand the capital's local government into the suburbs. After 31 years of continuous Labour rule on its inner city predecessor, the London County Council. However, there is a notable personal element. Johnson's 8 years running London are central to his personal mythology as a politician, and were arguably his key to his appeal to the Conservatives to replace Theresa May as someone who could prove that he could win Labour strongholds. He delivered on this by winning an 80-seat Commons majority by recolouring much of Labour's red wall in blue. This time, Johnson's appeal across the party divides was very different. In City Hall, Johnson combined very recognisably Conservative attitudes to issues such as policing with an at times liberal image, an Islington-dwelling cycling mayor who backed an amnesty for undocumented migrants. In contrast, as Prime Minister, he was the designer of an ultra-tough Brexit, presiding over a number 10 fizzing with forays into culture wars on race, statues and the BBC. And as a politician, Johnson is famously adaptable. But some of the close observers wonder at heart, was he more comfortable with the mayoral incarnation? One thing is certain, he seems to take the expected Conservative humbling in London very personally. I think it feels it's his turf, as it were, and it's quite possible he resents the Tories losing there, says Jenny Jones, a Green peer who was a London Assembly member and has had many clashes with the then mayor. Jones wonders whether the government's recent announcement that the London electoral system will be moved to a first-past-the-post to penalise smaller parties such as hers could be in part be a belated revenge. I think he did find it very uncomfortable to be challenged. It must have annoyed him that we were there, constantly drawing attention to his flaws. While Johnson remains publicly loyal to Bailey, there is an inescapable sense that he feels that if he were unleashed onto the mayoral fray again, he would have had a chance of defeating Khan. But those on the side of Labour's political divide view this as a fantasy. Johnson has consistently underestimated Sadiq, says an ally of the Labour mayor, and he does not take Sadiq's success very personally. Khan, they argue, is an adept as Johnson in winning the war in the new age of social value politics. For example, his public disputes with Donald Trump. And while the Conservatives may hope that a disastrous London election month will be largely down to Bailey's failings, this could be a false comfort. The ally said, that would make sense if more than half of Londoners had even heard of Sean Bailey, but they just haven't. And so we can take some sort of comfort that obviously when this mayoral race done, it does look like Sadiq Khan will win. And as has been mooted more than once now, when he is potentially done with his mayoral time in London, it is very likely we could one day see him make a push to be Labour leader. And I think that is quite a good idea. It was mooted that obviously when Jeremy Corbyn was being ousted in the last leadership election, everyone was saying all of Labour's big heavy hitters, Khan, Dan Jarvis, Andrew, can't remember his second name, the guy who's the mayor of Manchester, all were very, very big Labour heavy hitters, but they were all too busy to running their own mayoral stuff to get involved in the leadership campaign. And like I say, they couldn't get involved. But this does raise the question of when all these three are done with their mayoral escapades, might we be seeing one of these guys potentially replacing Keir Starmer? And like I've said this before many times, if we get rid of Keir Starmer, who replaces him? Currently at the moment, you can't have Khan, you can't have Andy Burnham, that's his name, Andy Burnham, we can't have Dan Jarvis because they are all involved in their mayoral stuff, and that means that they can't take leadership of the party. Needless to say, at the moment, I can't think of anyone else currently in Labour who would be up to taking the challenge and taking on Johnson. And I think at the moment, Starmer is actually the guy that we need to take on Johnson. Now, I think he has proved it more than enough times at Prime Minister's Question Times. The problem is he now needs to actually, as we've said hundreds and hundreds of times before, actually set out a direction for what he wants Labour to be if it gets power. And that is massive because, as we saw during their last, the leaked report, no one knows what Labour stands for. And that is in part down to Keir Starmer and his leadership team. You know, that fault entirely rests on them. So, as always, thanks for watching. Please do remember to hit that like, share and subscribe button. And of course, down below there is a link to my Patreon page and a one-off donation link as well called Buy Me Coffee, where you can buy me a coffee. And as always, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you all next time.